Well, meanwhile, the United States has called on all political sides in Kenya to refrain from violence and for security forces to act with restraint during ongoing protests. State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel said the U.S. regretted the loss of life and damage to property during the protests, noting that the right to peaceful assembly was a core aspect of democracy. Mr. Patel said during a press briefing on Tuesday, "We encourage political leaders, protesters and all parties to refrain from violence and rhetoric that could incite violence. We call on government security forces to act with restraint while protecting public safety and property."
Earlier in this bulletin, we did tell you about Kenyan President William Ruto's warning that he would deal with all those involved in criminal activity during last Monday's protest in the country. The protests are being staged against the government because of high food prices and a general soaring and cost of living affecting the citizens. Now, Arise analyst Mark Bichachi joins us now to look at efforts being made by Kenyan authorities to change the law guarding protests. Many thanks for joining us, Mark. Let's get straight into it. Now, we are aware of what their demands are, and, we've seen visuals of, people, the protesters being, have water cannons being shown at them, tear gas being thrown at them, and then we're now seeing the opposition leader saying that they should respect the rights of the Kenyan people to protest. Now, what do you make of this? How do we balance this out, the fact that they can protest and the fact that the police are not allowing them to do so?
Well, it is interesting because let me start with the president's statement saying that he is going to deal with anyone who breaks the law. The reason he said that, it is widely assumed by many that the people who broke into Raila Odinga's property and Uhuru Kenyatta, the former president's property, are from the side of the government. So we have seen that the government then in dealing with the protests has been extremely violent. We've seen videos of them shooting live bullets. We've seen them unnecessarily tear gassing and water cannoning the people. This is indeed a sad state of affairs in terms of the democratic right of citizens to protest. But the violence that is being meted, one on churches by the demonstrators themselves and on mosques on the other hand in retaliation, and the attack of personal property of the former president and the former prime minister is also unacceptable. So this is becoming a conflict in which both the government and the opposition seem like they're participating in acts of violence contrary to the constitution, whilst the government itself is also trying to stem the tide of violence. So we are hoping that the escalation will stop and the government will come to its senses, and the opposition protesters will also not protest in a manner that is illegal or causes violence or damage to people and property.
Now, Mark, while this is being put behind the facade of protesting against rising food prices and decreased quality of living, of course, we have seen Raila Odinga declare several times that he will do what it takes to delegitimize William Ruto's government. How much of this is political?
Well, I will tell you, this is 50% political. Why? Because 50% of the issues stemmed from the past election, with Raila Odinga claiming that the win of William Ruto of 200,000 against him was rigged. It continued into the issues where the Electoral Commission has been taken through a process where it seems like the president's side will choose the commissioners moving forward. So Raila Odinga has complained about these issues, and these are political issues. And let's not forget that Raila Odinga's main base and support is within the city of Nairobi, our capital city. So it is entirely a political affair. 50% of it is political. The other half is that the Kenyan people generally feel like that, one, the cost of living has not been addressed, and the president and his regime seems insensitive to their desires. For example, when they declared that they would have 50 new positions created in the top of government in a country where there's supposed to be austerity measures. So it is on one side very political, and on the other side it is about the cost of living.
So what's next, Mark? I mean, we are seeing the opposition still calling for renewed protest. We saw that on Monday, and the renewed protest that's supposed to take place tomorrow on Thursday. Now, following this recent announcement from President Ruto, how is that going to affect the protests going forward?
Well, there are two paths ahead of us. One path is a descent further into chaos and a bit of anarchy, simply because if again there's going to be an attack on the private property of the former prime minister and the former president, that will escalate the violence and the tensions in the country. If, however, the protests are allowed to continue without the police being overtly violent, then the steam will fall off the engine of Raila Odinga's protests, and we will see the protests end. The third option, which we hope for, is that both the president and Raila Odinga tone down on their rhetoric, they tone down on their hardline stance, and they're able to address the issues upon which the citizens of the country are complaining. And of course, the new regulations that are being proposed will only further to make the protests harder and more violent, simply because there is a faction of protesters who actually desire the violence and actively look out for violence. And once they are provoked, then we see the kind of scenes that we saw on Monday. So this calls for de-escalation, and I hope that the president and the former prime minister will come to their senses and de-escalate what is going on.
Thank you for that, Mark. You know, history has a way of repeating itself, especially where Raila Odinga is concerned. We see him continuously being involved in post-election violence in one form or another, and it seems he's always rewarded for it. He's pacified via a handshake or an appointment. Do you think that the end of this impasse, or that the end game for Raila Odinga, is a political handshake?
I think if he's dreaming of a political handshake, he's backing up the wrong tree when it comes to President William Ruto. President William Ruto has been clear from the beginning that he's not going to settle for any handshake. He's not going to allow Raila Odinga to bully him. Raila Odinga himself has said that he's not looking for a handshake this time around. He's fighting for the rights of the people. And at this point, I must say that Raila Odinga is lucky in the sense that the cost of living is so high, because that is the main reason why people are on the street demonstrating. If the president is able to tame the runaway inflation, I doubt whether Raila Odinga will have the support that he is enjoying now in this particular protest. And I can honestly tell you that many of the protesters are not protesting because they support Raila Odinga, because many Kenyans are tired of Raila Odinga's cycle of complaints. So this is about the cost of living, and if the president and the government are able to tame it, then Raila Odinga will have no legs to stand on, because his political agenda is not necessarily the agenda of the people of Kenya.
I mean, definitely, the focus of this protest is on the high cost of living, and you know, the government keeping the promises that they made in August 2022. Now, has there been any kind of, communication, from the current administration to try and maybe start to pacify and maybe meet the demands of the protesters, as it may?
Well, there has been none, and the stance of the government has been that this is a Raila Odinga crusade. It has nothing to do with the cost of living. They've not addressed the issues that the common citizen is asking about. Instead, they are focused on, one, accusing Raila Odinga of violence in his past, and two, accusing Uhuru Kenyatta, claiming that the former president is the sponsor of these particular rallies and demonstrations, and therefore it is Uhuru Kenyatta that should pay the price. Indeed, the attack on the former president's farm was confirmation to many that the president and the government sees these demonstrations as a purely political issue and has nothing to do with the cost of living, because the president and his deputy have not spoken about the cost of living and how they're going to address it at all throughout these demonstrations, which are now going into their second week.
One thing they are talking about, of course, is potential regulation, potential review of laws to regulate how, when, where protests can take place. Now, this sort of echoes what we saw happening in Tanzania with President John Magufuli, and it caused a lot of anti-democratic sentiment towards him, amongst many other things. If this law is to pass, if William Ruto and his government and Gachagua are able to get this passed, how will the outlook look for his government as a democratically elected government potentially cracking down on the rights of people to protest freely?
it is expected that the courts would not allow for such a law to pass. That is number one. But secondly, this would not bode well to the president's outlook, because right now, and based on recent polling, his popularity is dropping. He's not been able to keep the promises that he made during his campaigns. And already he is sitting at a place where he's becoming an unpopular president. That is compounded by the fact that there's a high cost of living. So these regulations would only, one, sour his reputation in the country, but also they would not stop the demonstrations. As I've said before, a lot of the people who demonstrate in this country like the violence. They like it when the police attack them. They like it when they have running battles, because remember, this city has over 40% people living in the slums, and these people are more than willing to fight the police because they have nothing to lose. So number one is those regulations would not bode well in terms of his democratic credentials as president, but two, they will not serve to stop the protests. And number three, I can promise you that those regulations will not be followed either by the organizers of the protests or the protesters themselves. So it is an exercise in futility and will only serve to reduce the credentials of the president as a democratic leader.
Mark, I'm trying to get a sense of what, Nairobi feels like right now. I know that the central business district remained calm and most businesses were closed due to the uncertainty of how far out this protest could go. But I know that Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua shared photos of himself early on Monday and urged Kenyans to report to work. What is the current feel in Nairobi right now? Are we seeing some, return to normalcy, or how is this going to pan out eventually?
Well, it's interesting. The people of Nairobi are accustomed to demonstrations. So on Monday, they avoided work. Many people did not go to work, especially those who work in the central business district. But come Monday evening, there was people were back to motion. Night activities happened as normal. On Tuesday, everybody went to work. And this is the normal for Kenyans. Kenyans will demonstrate one day and the next be back in the office. But is there tension on Monday and on Thursday when these particular protests happen? Yes, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of apprehensions. People don't move around, business is reduced, and generally there's a sense of a public holiday, as supporters of Raila would call it, or a disruption of business, as supporters of President William Ruto would call it. So it is a mixed mood in that sense, that there are people who are celebrating the fact that there are demonstrations and those who are complaining the disruption of business. And that's how it is generally. Our hope is that we can return to normalcy. But if things escalate the way it did on Monday, then I can assure you it will be worse. And regarding the call to return to office, interestingly enough, it is the police who stopped people coming into the city because of the fear of people gathering within the precincts of the city, which is why the demonstrators ended up going around the city central business district instead of being in the central business district. So it is an interesting catch-22 for the government. In one hand, they want to keep the protesters at bay. The other hand, they want people to go back to work. And it's difficult to separate and to differentiate between someone going to work and someone going into the CBD for demonstration purposes. So it's a bit of a tough place for them.
Thank you very much, Mark Bichachi, joining us from Kenya.